Good evening, and welcome to another edition of The Boogeyman. For those unfamiliar with the film, it follows the stereotypical horror movie trope of teenagers having sex and then getting into trouble for having sex. Specifically, it follows, basically it's a story about a haunted STD, in which when you have sex you pass it on to the person that you have sex with, and then creatures start following you. Because, why not? But when I was thinking of this film, it kind of was a mix of one of my favorite subgenres of horror, which is specifically body horror. So for those unfamiliar with body horror, if you've seen any of the early films by David Cronenberg, like Videodrome or The Brood, or any such films, it follows kind of this idea that the horror inherent in the film is about mutation, about genetics, about things to do with the body. It follows somewhat follows this formula in the respect that it's about a haunted STD, but there's no real mutation. It's more of a haunted horror film where the haunt is by STD. Giggity. But body horror in general is all about mutilation, disease, any such thing. It's kind of a difficult subgenre to define because in a way almost every horror film is about some sort of dismemberment or danger of bodily harm, and it's kind of the modus operandi to get people scared is to have a character in peril, and their body is in peril of being destroyed. However, body horror kind of emphasizes the destruction of the body. I think a very closely related subgenre to body horror would be what a lot of horror fans call torture porn, in which the emphasis is on mutilation of the human body. In fact, in a way, the torture porn genre could be kind of a subgenre where you have kind of horror and then body horror and then torture porn. But I digress. The interesting thing about body horror is it kind of speaks to all of our fears of bodily harm. If you've ever had a near miss when it comes to any sort of industrial accident or car accident, it's a very scary experience, and I think it's a universal experience that, we have a very fragile shell that we don't want to be destroyed. And obviously the body horror kind of really emphasizes, plays with, toys with this idea. Now, what's interesting is one of the films that comes to immediately to mind when it comes to body horror, and a personal favorite of mine is the Cenobite characters from Hellraiser. Now, the interesting thing about that is if you know the backstory to Clive Barker's creation, he actually visited S&M clubs when he was in the early writing stages of the Hellbound Heart, which was the novella that spawned Hellraiser. And he was kind of both horrified and intrigued by what he's seen in these sadomasochist clubs, and he kind of just took it one step further. Now, what's interesting is the body horror subgenre with films like American Mary very much so play on this trope of conscious bodily harm. And the Hellraiser characters of the Cenobites, in general, not all of them, but in general, the characters willingly agree to be mutilated.
And to think I hesitate.
More often than not because they don't know the terms of their agreement with the puzzle box or with the Cenobites themselves. But what's interesting is there's this engineering behind it, this rebuilding, a Frankenstein-esque rebuilding of the human body to very horrific ends. It's interesting because a lot of religious people think of God, for example, as an engineer. And this is kind of rewriting and reinterpreting his blueprints of the human body. It becomes horrific almost unintentionally. All you have to do to be horrific when it comes to this is reassemble the human body in interesting ways, in mutated ways. And we see this horror of the mutation in films like The Hills Have Eyes and other such sort of films, which shakily kind of enter into the body horror genre, because the fear is still, oh my god, these people are so mutated, they're so changed, they're so inhuman, and that becomes the frightening thing. Again, it's all about the body, hence body horror. Derp. Now, why is this genre relevant? This genre is relevant, of course, when you look at things like evolution. It makes you ask questions about the engineering of mankind, and as an atheist, obviously, I have issue with the idea that we've been engineered perfectly. We haven't. When it comes to reproductive organs, they're sitting right next to the trash bin. But this idea of re-engineering us it is relevant in a modern time when you look at things like genetic engineering and the advancement of medical science. It begs the question of, is it ethical to rearrange ourselves to be something new? And of course, there's kind of two camps in this. There's the, oh my god, no, that's horrific camp that looks at it very much so like a Frankenstein cautionary tale. Like look what happened to the Frankenstein monster. He was an abomination, he did horrible things. And ironically, you can use the Frankenstein mythos on the opposite side as well, because when you look at the original Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the monster himself wasn't a very horrific creature, except after encountering very horrific things in the environment, very repulsive and offensive treatment by others that eventually just kind of broke him down into this monstrous creature, which of course was the beauty of the Mary Shelley Frankenstein story, in that it really blended this idea of nature versus nurture, and it didn't really have an easy answer. Was he evil and corrupt because he was created in a horrific menagerie of re-engineering the human body, or was he horrific because he was treated horrific? And I don't think there's any easy answer when it comes to Frankenstein, and I think that's the fun thing about body horror is throughout, it's very much so not a genre interested in answering that question in as much as playing with the what-ifs. In playing with for example, what if we do have a soul, what if we re-engineer everything about it to the point where what comes out is unrecognizable from when it started? And of course, if the soul is immortal, then you have free play. You can tear off an arm and not kill somebody. You can tear off a head, put it in the butt. Whatever re-engineering the crazy minds behind the Cenobites can think of, they can do it without killing the tortured soul that they're doing it to. In fact, there was a line of toys that Clive Barker played with. Toys, yes, very much so, not for kids, called Tortured Souls, which played with this idea of re-engineering the human body through mad science, through a sort of S&M play, and kind of had its own story that was very closely related to the Cenobite story, just kind of maybe an earlier precursor story to the Cenobite order. So the thing about body horror is it raises a lot of questions about what it means to be human. For example, if I dismember a person down to their core, are they still human as a quadriplegic? If there is such a thing as a soul, if their soul even gets re-engineered, are they still the person they once were? Which is kind of the story arc of, at least in the films, the story arc of the Hellraiser series. You know, there's a lot of films that play with the curiosity that we have about the human body. I think even the least sociopathic or psychopathic people kind of wonder what all this gushy stuff looks like. And you have films like American Guinea Pig that explore that in very gruesome detail, which personally I still have yet to see, and I'm still scared to see, because a film that makes a Serbian film look like Care Bears, okay. But there is this exploration element of it. I wouldn't say that this exploration isn't morbid. Of course it is morbid. Then you have a film like American Mary, which plays with this idea of what is normal when it comes to body modification. Is it normal to get an ear piercing when you're mutilating your body to a small degree to get it? Is it normal to stitch fabric into a person's leg to make this cool tattoo thing?
We want you to take off our left arms and exchange them with one another.
That shouldn't be a problem.
Which the Soska sisters do in the film, and the Soska sisters are watching this. You're awesome. So it plays with the idea of, obviously in modern society with tattoos and other body modifications being seen as kind of more normal and much less transgressive, we have this society that can play with this, and American Mary attempts to kind of push the envelope and say, okay, well, there's obvious places where she's gone too far. But the question is, which exact body modifications does she have? Does she utilize that go too far, so to speak. There's two types of body modifications that she does. There's the body modifications she does per request of her client, and then there's the one she uses as kind of revenge against other people in her life who have done her wrong. Now, the interesting thing is the line in between these two is a very thin line. Some of the things that Mary is requested to do throughout the film are actually to somebody outside of the body modification groups anyways, is actually extremely kind of disturbing and kind of blur the line of what's appropriate to do, even with permission. And the things that she does per revenge kind of are not even quite as horrific, or at least as equally as horrific as some of the things she's doing as per request. Now, this makes it interesting because it blurs the line of what is normal. And body horror kind of does, horror in general kind of does that. It blurs the line between what is normal and what is profane, what is kind of scary. And why it's scary. Is it scary because it's abnormal? Is it scary because it's unknown? Is it scary because we just don't know enough about that topic? Horror explores all of these questions. The reason I began this episode with a spoof of It Follows is while I was watching that film, it kind of struck me as an odd conglomeration of a couple different kinds of horror, because body horror is often called venereal horror. Venereal as in venereal disease. Giggity! And It Follows obviously follows this formula of this kind of really odd sort of STD. And what's interesting is it doesn't really take the body horror formula and explore it in terms of mutilating or mutating or even causing much bodily harm, in as much as this idea of the stalker that comes out of it, something that never leaves. So it kind of plays with this idea of sexual fear, the fear of contact, the fear of what you can get from other people. It's the same kind of fear that when you see somebody with a runny nose, you don't want to shake their hand, right? It's this idea of when it is or is not appropriate to have human contact, and of course, in typical horror form, it's basically making the statement, we should be wary of this thing called sexuality. I always have kind of an issue a little bit with when horror takes this route, because I think it demonizes sexuality in a way, but I don't think in a lot of cases it's intentional. I don't think It Follows is saying sex is bad in any way, shape, or form, in as much as should be approached with caution. In the same way that, again, shaking somebody's hand who has a drippy nose might be something you want to second guess and try to figure out a way to maybe just shake their forearm or something of that sort, right? A way to get around that sort of potential contamination. But moving on, body horror, the interesting thing about body horror is it makes us question what is normal for our body. Is it normal for mutations, for example? Is it normal for people who have certain disabilities, like the werewolf boy that we've all heard of that has a lot of facial hair and has this mutation where he very much so is the human equivalent of the werewolf. It's still interesting to look at whether this is normal or abnormal, whether we should treat this as normal or abnormal, whether, even though it might be an anomaly, is it still right to treat it as an anomaly? It's still right to treat it as an abnormality, I should say. So body horror addresses a lot of these issues, and it also, like I said, addresses the common issue we all have as humans about fear of just everything to do with the body. Anyone who's seen the Surgery Channel knows how scary the body can be. We're all one thin line between life and death, and that's interesting to us as a species. Like I was saying with the Frankenstein myth, it's interesting to ask the question of, is there really a difference between our bodies and our lives? When we die, if you could rebuild the body to exactly the way it was before it died, replace the heart, replace the brain, replace whatever have you that broke down, like exchanging parts on a car.
Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Would that be ethical to do? Would that be the same person that comes out of it? It's kind of the same question that you can get on a small scale. If I lose a hand and get a prosthetic hand, am I still overall the same person? How much of my body do I have to lose before I become a different person? If I have a lung transplant, am I a different person because I have this integral part of my organs exchanged for someone else? Am I haunted by that person's spirit? And a lot of horror kind of talks about this. For example, The Eye, an older film that got remade in a terrible American remake with Jessica Alba. Sorry, Jessica, but you're not the greatest of actresses. You're hot, though. And it kind of addresses this idea of, if we have an integral part donated to us from a donor, be it an eye, a lung, or whatever have you. I don't think brain transplants are really technically possible, but in theory. Are we somehow engaged with the spirit of the pieces that are coming into us? It's an interesting question, and one I think is a little bit absurd. As an atheist, I obviously don't believe in spooky spirits and whatnot, but obviously within the horror genre, there's kind of the suspension of disbelief when it comes to these things that even I have, where it's interesting to think about this what if. What if I get a hand transplant, am I, from a serial killer, am I going to try to what is this? Kill people by really, I don't know. I blame society. But anyways, this idea of what things can we change about the body and still retain our original essence? Is there even such a thing as an original essence? Or is there just the body? Now, of course, another bit of body horror that people might not necessarily think of body horror is this idea of the amnesiac who doesn't remember who he is, and they have damage to their brain. I believe Gothica was one, if I'm not mistaken. I'll have to research that. Not Halle Berry's best film. She should stick to Storm. Sorry, Halle. But he examines this idea of when we have damage to our central processing unit, what can happen? Can we turn into a serial killer all of a sudden? Could we be a serial killer before the accident and come out a normal person? Can we do all kinds of things? Shutter Island kind of emphasizes this, and again in a way that's not really directly body horror, but it's attached to the subgenre by virtue of expressing this what if the damage to the essence that we have as a human being changes our core identity. And I think that is very much at the heart of a lot of people's concerns. When you look into neuroscience, there's the Phineas Gage case. For those who don't know, was a person who had brain injuries, and kind of his loved ones would comment that he was a different person. And there's all these cases in neuroscience about people having brain damage and coming out a different person from the core person they were before. And it begs the question of, really is our core identity just an amalgamation of our brain chemistry and our body chemistry and our hormones and whatnot? Is it a combination of that and our environments? And it's a difficult question to answer, and I don't think science has ever really explicitly answered the question. Although, personally, I'm a very deterministic person. I think that for the most part, we are the summation of all of our parts. And then if you remove the part, you remove the core. But again, that begs the question of, well, how much? For example, a lot of people can actually operate with a certain part of their brain either damaged, destroyed, or removed. Are they the same person? There will often be changes in their personality. Does that make them a different person? It also begs the question of, if changes in their personality is enough to say that they're a different person, then am I the same person as I was as a teenager, because I have changed quite a bit as a person in general from the person I was when I was a teenager. And again, there's the question of, if I lose an arm, if I remove my arm and stitch it to my face and then slice open my chest and expose all that, am I still the same person? And obviously in the Hellraiser mythos, the answer is no, you're not the same person anymore, because most of the people that undergo this transformation become very demonic and evil and not hateful per se, just indifferent, extremely indifferent to other people, to the point where they don't really care and very, very sociopathic. Now, body horror does all these things, and again, it's very centered on this idea of, if I have 4 fingers instead of 5, am I a different person? If I lose my legs and have to learn how to overcome that, am I a different person? Or with diseases like the one that one of my heroes, Stephen Hawking, undergoes, which I believe is Lou Gehrig's disease. If it's not, I'll post something correcting myself. But who suffers from this disease where he's very much so physically different than the person he was before. This is the kind of question that body horror addresses. Is there such a thing as a human essence that you can destroy, manipulate, or somehow corrupt through mutilation, disease? Parasites are a big topic in body horror. A film like The Body Snatchers I don't think is necessarily body horror because there is no real exposition of the consequences to the body. It's more of a psychological thing. When I think of body horror, I think of something like John Carpenter's The Thing, in which there are these heavy modifications to the body and re-engineering and just disturbing mutations that happen when this alien parasite infects the human beings in the film. It kind of tears you into two pieces as an audience member. There's the one, and again, all horror kind of does this, there's the one side of you that's like, oh my god, that's this, bleh. And there's this other side that is very much so intrigued just because you haven't seen anything like this before. And again, this is something that comes up again and again in terms of curiosity. I'm personally trying to decide whether or not I want to watch certain films because they're very, very extreme, but again, I haven't seen them before. So a film like a Serbian film, for example, when I watched it, I had this reaction of distaste, disgust, but also kind of an appreciation for the fact that there's no other film like this specific film that I had watched. The Guinea Pig series from Japan also gave me that sort of curiosity. Body horror works so well because we all have a body, presumably. I'm assuming there's no ghosts in the theaters that are watching these films, but we all have a body, so we all know what it's like to worry about harm or mutation or illness or any of these things that we might encounter on a day-to-day basis. Even when you're driving, you might encounter somebody who swears in front of you in a dangerous fashion that makes you feel what it feels like to worry about your own physical safety. So I think there's a very big universality there, and I think that's one of the things that makes body horror so effective. Films like Shivers or Society, where you look at these kind of mutations and corruptions of human body. Another film, this film does this by exploring this sort of almost venereal disease sort of infestation that rots this person to the very core of their being. Not just in a zombie fashion. Beyond that, it literally disintegrates this person from the inside out. And that is interesting, not because we delight in death and destruction as horror fans, but because it's just an interesting thing to question what it's like to experience that. To question what it's like to experience this degradation. And the film is interesting because it kind of degrades, as she degrades, the film kind of degrades in psychological fashion, where it's difficult to tell what's going on, and she kind of starts to hallucinate, the main character starts to hallucinate, and it becomes a very, very experimental film, I guess. There's no other way to describe it. It was extremely experimental, and I quite enjoyed it. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it except to horror fans. And a lot of body horror, and a lot of horror in general, when it comes to the extreme side of it, is like that. It's difficult to recommend to people that are trying to get into the genre of horror in general, but it's something that you want to kind of make them aware of, that, you know, when you get to the comfort levels of it, these are the type of films that you might find interesting to watch. And I love experimental films for that reason alone, that they show you things that you probably haven't seen before. And it does that in the respect that it shows you literally somebody falling apart from the zombie's perspective, for lack of a better way of describing it. But the character, if you watch the film, you understand that the character is not necessarily a zombie in any traditional way, shape, or form. Contracted is another film that was compared to, because it has a very similar storyline, except the protagonist of Contracted is very much so more the traditional zombie. Wants to bite other people, wants to infect other people, and in that regards is probably more accurate a description of a parasite or a virus that wants to spread and mutate. Wants is a difficult term when it comes to these things, because the question becomes, they're not really alive, so can they really want? I don't know. You're the scientist. And so these films kind of explore a lot of things that are universal. Everybody knows what it feels like to worry about getting sick. Everyone knows what it's like to worry about bodily harm. And certain paranoid people, myself included, kind of wonder what it's like to wake up in a hospital rejiggered. So your face is in your butt, or you have a butt face. Just this idea of what things can you do to the human body that would change, and what changes would it in terms of the person's psyche. And It Follows does that to a degree. Like I said, it's not exactly body horror in the respect that the venereal disease is kind of a ghost in its own right, but it does that. Early films by David Cronenberg, like Shivers, Videodrome, do that. Then that film does that. Contracted. Even in terms of video games, we have video games like Dead Space, in which you see these creatures kind of become a very corrupted human being that's just very demonic and evil, and not demonic in a spiritual sense, but demonic in the sort of corruption sense of this physical corruption that becomes an enemy in the game, or even the game outlines.
You gotta have faith. And that's what I'm here for. To make you believe.
Which has these mutilated psych patients running around trying to scare you or confuse you or do a few other things to you.
You're sick!
It's a scary game. So those are the type of things that body horror addresses. And again, I think it's universal. We all have a body. We all worry about these things. And so I think it's one of the more effective genres, but I also think it blurs the line between itself as a subgenre and the genre as a whole. Because again, I think all horror inherently makes you worry about bodily harm to the characters that you're supposed to care about. I say supposed to because not every horror movie is effective in making you care about the characters. I'm looking at you, Hostel. I wanted every character dead. Sorry guys, you just weren't that interesting. But again, it's something that is inherent in every horror movie, that there's at least some sort of danger to the characters in terms of bodily harm, in terms of bodily mutation, or just bodily dismemberment, or bodily something. Their bodies might be infected with death. In a lot of ghost films, the ghost kind of touches them and they just kind of drop dead, and it's not really bodily harm per se, but there is obviously something that happens internally where their brain just goes pop, and then they die. So the subgenre bleeds very much so into the genre as a whole, but I think the thing that makes body horror specific is, again, the emphasis on seeing the effects that it has on the body, seeing the Cenobites re-engineered, seeing the dynamite for lady rejiggered and decayed, seeing venereal diseases pass on, just like in It Follows. So here we have come full circle back to It Follows. The scariness of haunted STDs. Man, I hate those. It's not a very well-known subgenre, but it is one that I think raises some interesting points. And again, with the upcoming film Frankenstein with Harry Potter, Daniel Radcliffe, and what's-his-face from Wanted, it becomes I think it's going to become a subgenre at the peak of people's psyche, that whether or not they know they're thinking about it. I think the Frankenstein mythos is very much so an agglomeration of all of these different aspects of the subgenre of body horror. So yeah, that's about all of the blabbering I can say about the body horror subgenre. If you have a body and have a finger, if you don't have fingers, I'm sorry, but if you do have a finger, then click the like or subscribe button. If you have fingers, then you can certainly type a comment. I'm looking at you. You can say what I have or have not addressed in the body horror subgenre, or what you'd like to see me do in the future, or if you'd like to see me do a specific type of subgenre that you think I haven't addressed yet. For example, goat horror. I'm sure it exists. Yeah, so, like I said, if you have fingers, like, subscribe, comment, share. And this is the Boogeyman saying so long. I'll miss you. Boo! So your face is in your butt,